The storm had been raging for 3 days when Marcus received the call that would change his life forever. Lightning split the Montana sky as his phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him from restless sleep. The caller ID showed Riverside Cemetery, his employer of 15 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus, we need you tonight, came the gravelly voice of Henry. Caldwell, the cemetery supervisor. Emergency burial, families paying triple rate for immediate interment. Marcus sat up, rubbing his weathered hands through graying hair. At 52, he dug more graves than he cared to count, but emergency burials in the middle of a thunderstorm were rare. What's the rush, Henry? Rich family from back east. The Whitmore estate. Their daughter died in a car accident, and they want her buried before dawn. Something about family tradition and the lunar cycle. Look, I don't ask questions when they're paying $20,000 for a single burial. 20,000. Marcus whistled low. That was more than he made in 6 months. I'll be there in an hour. The drive to Riverside Cemetery took Marcus through the winding roads of Pine Ridge, Montana, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The Whitmore name, however, was unfamiliar. In 15 years of living here, he'd never heard it mentioned in Sally's Diner or at the monthly town meetings. Rich out-of-towners weren't uncommon, but they usually made more of a splash. Rain hammered his pickup truck as he navigated the muddy path to the cemetery's maintenance shed. The headlights cut through sheets of water, illuminating weathered headstones that seemed to lean away from the wind. Marcus had always found comfort in cemeteries. They were peaceful, honest places where pretense died, along with the bodies beneath the soil. Tonight felt different. Henry's car was already there, engine running, wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. The old supervisor climbed out as Marcus parked, clutching a manila envelope to his chest. "Coordinates are in here," Henry shouted over the thunder. "Plot 247, near the old oak grove. The family will arrive at 4 a.m. sharp. Burial needs to be complete by sunrise." Marcus checked his watch. 11:30 p.m., 4.5 hours to dig a grave in a storm. He'd done harder jobs, but barely. "Where's the body?" "Already delivered. Sealed. Casket, no viewing?" They were very specific about that. Henry handed him the envelope. "The casket's expensive. Mahogany with brass fittings. Handle it carefully." As Henry drove away, his taillights disappearing into the storm, Marcus felt an odd chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd buried hundreds of bodies, from paupers in pine boxes to millionaires in marble tombs. Something about this job felt wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint what. The maintenance shed held his tools, shovels, a mechanical digger for the initial excavation, tarps, and industrial lighting. Marcus loaded everything onto the small utility trailer and began the slow journey to Plot 247. The cemetery's narrow roads had turned to mud, and twice he had to stop to push fallen branches out of the way. Plot 247 sat in the oldest section of Riverside Cemetery, where the trees grew thick and the headstones bore dates from the 1800s. The designated spot lay beneath a massive oak tree whose branches provided some shelter from the rain. Marcus set up his work lights, their harsh white glow creating an eerie circle in the darkness. The mahogany casket sat nearby on a wooden platform, covered by a black tarp. Even in the storm, Marcus could see it was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. The kind that cost more than most people's cars, yet something about it seemed hastily prepared. The brass nameplate was blank, and the finish looked fresh, as if it had been completed just hours before. Marcus began his work with the mechanical digger, its diesel engine coughing to life despite the rain. The ground was soft from 3 days of continuous downpour, which made the digging easier but also more dangerous. Water pooled at the bottom of each scoop, and he had to constantly pump it out to prevent cave-ins. 2 hours in, he was 3 feet down, when his shovel struck something hard. Not rock, something that gave slightly under pressure. Marcus cleared away the mud and found what looked like wooden planks. His blood ran cold. There was already something buried here. He worked faster now, his heart pounding. The wooden structure became clearer as he excavated around it. It was a casket, an old one, probably from the early 1900s based on the simple construction. But according to the cemetery records, plot 247 had never been used. Marcus had checked the ledger himself. The old casket was positioned exactly where the new one was supposed to go. Someone had made a serious mistake, but at this hour, with the family arriving in 2 hours, there was no time to relocate. Marcus would have to dig deeper, placing the new casket above the old one. Not ideal, but not unheard of in older cemeteries where space was limited. As he prepared to continue digging around the old casket, something stopped him. A sound that didn't belong in a cemetery at midnight during a thunderstorm. It was faint, almost lost in the rain and wind, but unmistakable once he focused on it. Tapping. 3 slow taps, then silence, then 3 more. Marcus stood frozen, shovel in hand, rain streaming down his face. The sound was coming from inside the old casket. His rational mind raced through explanations, settling wood, expanding, metal, even small animals that might have found their way inside. But the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. He knelt beside the casket, pressing his ear to the wood. The tapping came again, stronger this time, followed by what sounded like scratching. Then, faintly but clearly, a voice. "Help me." Marcus jerked back so violently he slipped in the mud. Impossible. He'd been digging graves for decades. He knew the difference between imagination and reality, between storm sounds and human voices. But the voice came again, clearer now. "Please, somebody help me." It was a woman's voice, weak but definitely alive. Marcus's hands shook as he grabbed his crowbar. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible, that people didn't survive in buried caskets, that he was losing his mind. But the voice was real, and it was getting weaker. The old casket's lid was held by corroded nails that gave way with surprising ease. Marcus pried off the top board, then another, working frantically as the voice inside grew more urgent. When he finally opened enough space to see inside, his headlamp illuminated a sight that would haunt him forever. A young woman lay inside, very much alive, her dark hair matted with dirt and moisture. She couldn't have been more than 25, with pale skin and delicate features that suggested she'd once been quite beautiful. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a white dress that looked like it belonged in a museum. But her eyes were modern, intelligent, and filled with terror. "Thank God," she whispered, trying to sit up. "I thought I was going to die down here." Marcus helped her out of the casket, his mind reeling. She was real, solid, breathing, but she'd been buried in a casket in a plot that supposedly had never been used, wearing clothes that looked a century old. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, wrapping his rain jacket around her shivering form. "Sarah," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Sarah Mitchell, what year is it?" The question sent ice through Marcus's veins. "It's 2024, October 15th. Sarah's face went white. "That's impossible. I was buried in 1923. My father, he said I was dead, but I wasn't. I was sick, but I wasn't dead." She looked around at the modern work lights, the mechanical digger, Marcus's contemporary clothing. "How long was I in there?" Marcus did quick math. If she was telling the truth, and the evidence of his own eyes suggested she was, Sarah Mitchell had been buried alive for over a century. The rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, but the woman sitting before him was undeniably real and undeniably alive. "We need to get you to a hospital," Marcus said, but Sarah shook her head. "No hospitals, no doctors. They're the ones who declared me dead the first time." She looked at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. Save my life. In my time, that means something. It creates a bond. Thunder crashed overhead and Marcus realized he still had a job to finish. The Whitmore family would arrive in less than 90 minutes, expecting to find their daughter's grave ready. But now he had a woman who claimed to be from 1923 sitting in the hole where the new casket was supposed to go. Sarah, I need to finish this burial. There's another family coming and... The Whitmores, Sarah said quietly. I know them. They're the reason I was buried alive the first time. Marcus felt the world tilt around him. What do you mean? Sarah stood up slowly, steadying herself against the edge of the grave. Despite having been buried for supposedly over a century, she moved with surprising grace. The Whitmores have been burying people alive for generations. It's how they maintain their power, their influence. They fake deaths and bury people who threaten them, who know too much. That's impossible, Marcus said, but even as he spoke, he remembered Henry's oddly specific instructions, the blank nameplate on the expensive casket, the rush to bury before dawn. Is it? Sarah asked. Think about tonight. A family you've never heard of in a town where everyone knows everyone. A rush burial with no viewing, no ceremony. A sealed casket that arrived before you even got the call. She pointed to the mahogany casket under its top. I'd bet anything that the casket doesn't contain a dead body. Marcus's blood ran cold. He walked over to the casket and lifted the top. The brass nameplate wasn't blank. It read, Emily Whitmore, beloved daughter, 1999-2024. But something about the weight seemed off. The casket was too light for a body. We have to open it, Sarah said, reading his thoughts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I can't. It's not my place, and the family are murderers, Sarah said. Firmly, if I'm right, there's either another person suffocating in there, or it's empty, and this whole thing is a setup. Marcus looked between Sarah and the casket. Every professional instinct told him to call Henry, to call the police, to follow proper procedures. But Sarah's words rang with truth, and her very existence proved that impossible things could happen. With hands that trembled from more than cold, Marcus approached the casket with his crowbar. If he was wrong, he'd lose his job, face criminal charges, destroy his reputation. If Sarah was right, he might save a life. The casket's latch gave way with a soft click. Marcus lifted the lid slowly, his headlamp cutting through the darkness inside. The casket was empty except for a small electronic device attached to the lid, some kind of timer with wires leading to what looked like air canisters. As Marcus examined it more closely, he realized what he was looking at. A system designed to provide limited oxygen to someone inside, then stop after a predetermined time. They're coming back for whoever was supposed to be in here, Sarah said quietly. This was never meant to be a permanent burial. The Whitmores fake deaths, bury people alive with limited air, then return later to retrieve them for whatever purpose they have in mind. Marcus checked his watch, 3:15 a.m. The family would arrive in 45 minutes. His mind raced through possibilities, all of them bad. If Sarah was right, he'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than a simple emergency burial. We need to leave, he said, both of us, right now. But Sarah shook her head. Running won't solve anything. The Whitmores have resources, connections. They'll find us eventually. She looked at him with startling intensity. But there is another way. In my time, when someone saved your life, you could claim protection through marriage. Immediate marriage before dawn creates a legal bond that even powerful families couldn't easily break. Marcus stared at her. You're suggesting we get married? We just met, and you were buried for a century, and... I'm suggesting we survive, Sarah interrupted. The Whitmores are coming. They expect to find an empty grave and a compliant gravedigger who asks no questions. Instead, they'll find you've discovered their operation. Do you think they'll just let you walk away? Thunder rolled across the cemetery. As Marcus considered their options, every logical thought told him this was insane, but nothing about this night had been logical. Sarah Mitchell, if that was even her real name, was right about one thing: he knew too much now, and powerful people didn't let loose ends survive. "There's a 24-hour chapel in town," Marcus said slowly. "Judge Morrison performs emergency ceremonies." Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd pulled her from the grave. "Then we'd better hurry. Dawn is only 3 hours away, and the Whitmores don't like to be kept waiting." As they gathered Marcus's tools and prepared to leave, he took one last look at the empty casket with its sinister breathing apparatus. Tomorrow he'd been planning to sleep in, maybe watch football, call his sister in Denver. Instead, he was about to marry a woman who claimed to be from 1923 and flee from a family of would-be murderers. Marcus had always believed life was predictable, that graves stayed dug and the dead stayed buried. Sarah Mitchell had shattered those assumptions in the space of a few hours. As they climbed into his pickup truck and drove away from Riverside Cemetery, he realized his old life was as buried as the empty casket they'd left behind. The storm was beginning to clear as they reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge. But Marcus knew the real tempest was just beginning. Judge Morrison lived above his law office on Main Street, and fortunately for Marcus and Sarah, he was known throughout Pine Ridge for his willingness to perform emergency ceremonies at any hour. The old Victorian house stood dark against the clearing sky, but a single light burned in the third-floor window where the judge kept his private chambers. Sarah had remained quiet during the drive, staring out at the modern streetlights and paved roads with wonder. Now, as they stood before the judge's door, she turned to Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Before we do this," she said, "you should know the truth about who I am and why the Whitmores wanted me buried." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What truth?" "My father wasn't just any man in 1923. He was Senator Robert Mitchell, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. I discovered something I wasn't supposed to: correspondence between my father and the Whitmore patriarch about a scheme to manipulate silver prices. When I confronted him, he had me declared mentally unstable and arranged for my death from pneumonia." The pieces began clicking together in Marcus's mind. The Whitmores have been doing this for over a century. Longer. The family's wealth comes from eliminating inconvenient people and seizing their assets. They've perfected the art of making murders look like natural deaths or accidents. Sarah's eyes hardened. "But something went wrong with my burial. Instead of dying, I entered some kind of suspended state. I've been conscious but unable to move, unable to speak, for all these years." Marcus shuddered at the thought. A century of aware paralysis would drive anyone insane. Yet Sarah seemed remarkably composed for someone who'd endured such horror. "How are you so normal?" he asked. "Time moves differently when you're trapped between life and death. It felt more like a long, strange dream than 100 years. She touched his arm gently. "But you woke me up. Your voice, your light, your refusal to accept that I was dead. It pulled me back to full consciousness." They climbed the wooden steps to Judge Morrison's door. Marcus had worked with the judge before on estate matters related to the cemetery, and the elderly man had always struck him as honest and unafraid of powerful people. If anyone could help them, it would be Morrison. The judge answered the door in a bathrobe, his white hair disheveled from sleep. "Marcus, what in blazes are you doing here at 3 a.m? "Emergency situation, Judge. We need to be married before dawn." Morrison looked between Marcus and Sarah, taking in her old-fashioned dress and pale complexion. His experienced eyes missed nothing. "Come inside. Both of you look like you've seen a ghost." The judge's chambers were lined with law books and dominated by a massive oak desk covered in case files. Morrison gestured for them to sit while he moved to a cabinet and withdrew a marriage license form. Montana law requires a waiting period, except in cases of imminent departure from the state or extraordinary circumstances, Morrison said, studying them carefully. Which category applies here? Marcus looked at Sarah, unsure how much to reveal. She leaned forward and spoke directly to the judge. Judge Morrison, are you familiar with the Whitmore family? The judge's expression darkened immediately. I know of them. What's your connection? They tried to have me murdered, and now they're after both of us. Marriage before dawn will provide legal protections that might keep us alive long enough to expose them. Morrison set down his pen and walked to his window, gazing out at the lightening sky. The Whitmores own half the state legislature and 3 federal judges. If they want you dead, a marriage certificate won't stop them. It might slow them down, Sarah said. Spousal privilege, joint property rights, inheritance laws. It creates complications they'll need time to navigate legally, time we can use. The judge turned back to them. Who are you, young lady? You speak like someone with legal training. Sarah Mitchell. My father was Senator Robert Mitchell. Morrison's eyes widened. Senator Mitchell died in 1924, and he had no children. The historical record is quite clear on that. The historical record was written by the Whitmores, Sarah replied. They erased me from existence after they buried me alive. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Morrison returned to his desk and picked up his pen. I've seen enough corruption in my 40 years on the bench to know evil when it walks into my chambers, he said. If the Whitmores are involved, then extraordinary circumstances certainly apply. Let's get you married. The ceremony was brief but binding. Morrison spoke the traditional words, while Marcus and Sarah exchanged simple promises to protect and honor each other. They had no rings, but the judge assured them that wouldn't affect the legal validity. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife. Now, Morrison said, sealing the marriage certificate. In an envelope, what's your plan for staying alive past breakfast? Before either of them could answer, car doors slammed outside. Through the window, Marcus saw 3 black SUVs parked on Main Street. Men in expensive suits were climbing out, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They found us, Sarah whispered. Morrison moved quickly to his safe, withdrawing several documents and a small pistol. Back exit leads through my garden to the alley. Take these. He handed Marcus the sealed marriage certificate and what looked like legal papers. Property deed to my cabin on Bear Lake. It's in a trust that even the Whitmores can't touch easily. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs outside. Morrison checked the cylinder of his pistol and positioned himself by the door. Judge Morrison, came a cultured voice from the hallway. We know they're in there. Make this easy on yourself. Go, Morrison whispered to Marcus and Sarah. The cabin has supplies and communication equipment. Contact Agent Rebecca Foster at the FBI field office in Billings. Tell her Judge Morrison sent you and mention Operation Graveyard. What's Operation Graveyard? Marcus asked, but Morrison was already moving toward the front door. Later. Run now. They slipped through the back door into Morrison's garden as the judge opened his front door to confront the Whitmores. Marcus could hear voices rising in anger, but he couldn't make out words as he and Sarah hurried through the narrow alley behind Main Street. The pickup truck was parked 2 blocks away, and Marcus prayed the Whitmores hadn't found it yet. As they reached the vehicle, Sarah suddenly stopped. Marcus, there's something else you need to know before we go any further. He turned to face her, dreading what new revelation might come. What now? I'm not entirely human anymore. Whatever happened to me during those 100 years, it changed me. I can sense things, know things I shouldn't be able to know. That's how I knew about the Whitmores' plan tonight, how I know they're not going to give up easily. Marcus stared at her. What kind of things? I can feel life forces, hear thoughts sometimes. I knew you were a good man the moment you opened my casket because I could sense your soul." She touched his hand, and Marcus felt a strange warmth spread through his body. "I can also tell that you're falling in love with me, even though you think it's crazy." Heat flooded Marcus's cheeks. She was right. Despite the impossibility of the situation, despite knowing her for less than 4 hours, he felt drawn to Sarah in ways that defied logic. "Is it real?" he asked, "or is it some kind of supernatural influence?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Does it matter? We're married now, bound together by law and circumstance. Whether what you feel is natural attraction or mystical connection, we need each other to survive." They climbed into the truck and drove toward the outskirts of town. Bear Lake was 40 miles north, deep in the Glacier National Forest, where cell phone service was spotty and roads were little more than logging trails. If they could reach Morrison's cabin, they might have time to figure out their next move. As they drove through the awakening countryside, Sarah began telling Marcus about the true scope of the Whitmore operation. According to her century of unwilling observation, the family had been systematically eliminating threats to their power for generations. Politicians, journalists, business rivals, even ordinary citizens who stumbled onto their activities, all had met convenient accidents or sudden illnesses. "They don't always bury people alive," Sarah explained. "That's reserved for special cases where they need the person to disappear completely, but might want to retrieve them later for information or leverage. Usually, they just arrange for more conventional murders, disguised as natural causes." "Why didn't they just kill you outright?" Marcus asked. "Because my father was a senator, and even in 1923, the complete disappearance of a senator's daughter would have raised too many questions. They needed me declared dead through official channels, with a body that could be examined if necessary. The burial alive was meant to ensure I'd actually die while maintaining the fiction of natural death." They passed through the small town of Cedar Falls, where early morning commuters were heading to work, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Marcus envied their simple, predictable lives. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether to repair or replace his aging lawnmower. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "I need to tell you something else. The reason I survived burial for so long, the reason I've changed, I think I'm connected to the cemetery itself now. All those years underground, I absorbed something from the earth, from the other bodies buried there. I'm not sure I can survive away from that place for very long." Marcus felt his heart sink. "What do you mean?" "I'm growing weaker the farther we get from Riverside Cemetery. It's like I'm tethered there." She looked at her hands, which seemed paler than before. "We might have hours, maybe a day or two at most, before I start to fade. Then we go back. If we go back, the Whitmores will kill us both." Marcus pulled the truck over at a scenic overlook and turned to face his new wife. The morning sun cast golden light across her features, making her look almost ethereal. "Sarah, I've lived 52 years playing it safe, following rules, avoiding complications. Last night I found something worth fighting for. If you're connected to that cemetery, then we figure out how to use that connection against the Whitmores." She studied his face carefully. "You realize this probably ends with both of us dead. Maybe. Or maybe we expose a century of murder and save whoever they're planning to bury next." Marcus started the engine again. "But first, we contact Agent Foster and find out what Operation Graveyard is all about." Bear Lake appeared through the trees after another hour of driving. Morrison's cabin sat on a small peninsula, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that would be easy to defend. The structure was modest but well maintained, with solar panels on the roof and what looked like a sophisticated antenna array. Inside, they found supplies for extended stays, a shortwave radio setup, and a locked filing cabinet that opened with a key Morrison had included with the property deed. The files inside contained decades of research on the Whitmore family, complete with names, dates, and detailed accounts of suspicious deaths. Morrison's been investigating them for years, Marcus realized, scanning the documents. Look at this. They've killed at least 40 people since 1950, probably more going back to the early 1900s. Sarah was examining a map covered in red pins. These are all burial sites, not just Riverside Cemetery. They have operations in at least 12 states. Marcus found a secure satellite phone in the radio equipment and dialed the number Morrison had given them for Agent Foster. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Foster! Agent Foster, this is Marcus Thompson. Judge Morrison told me to call you about Operation Graveyard." There was a long pause. "How did you get this number?" "The Whitmores tried to kill us. Morrison helped us escape and said you'd know what that means." "Where are you now?" Marcus looked at Sarah, who nodded. "Bear Lake, Morrison's cabin." "Stay there. Don't move. Don't contact anyone else. Don't use any other communication devices. I'll be there in 6 hours with a full briefing." Foster's voice became urgent. "Mr. Thompson, if you've truly stumbled into a Whitmore operation, your life expectancy is measured in hours. Do exactly what I tell you." The line went dead. Marcus set down the phone and looked at Sarah, who was growing visibly paler. 6 hours, he said. "Can you last that long?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "I'll try, but if I don't make it, promise me you'll finish this. Don't let them keep killing people." Marcus took her hand, feeling that strange warmth again, stronger. "Now, we're going to finish this together. All of it, the Whitmores, the murders, everything." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Bear Lake, but Marcus knew their real test would come when Agent Foster arrived with the truth about Operation Graveyard. Whatever that truth might be, it would determine whether they lived to see another dawn or joined the long list of people the Whitmores had buried in unmarked graves. Agent Rebecca Foster arrived at Bear Lake exactly 6 hours after Marcus's call, but she didn't come alone. 3 unmarked vehicles wound their way down the dirt road to Morrison's cabin, carrying what appeared to be a full tactical team. Marcus watched through binoculars as agents in body armor positioned themselves around the property's perimeter. Sarah had grown noticeably weaker during the wait. She sat wrapped in blankets by the fireplace, her skin taking on an almost translucent quality. Whatever supernatural force kept her alive was clearly tied to her proximity to Riverside Cemetery, and every hour away from that place drained more of her remaining strength. "They're not taking chances," Marcus observed, watching Foster approach. The cabin alone, while her team maintained defensive positions. "Either they're here to help us, or we're about to become the government's problem instead of the Whitmores." Foster knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. She was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps 40, with short auburn hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of federal investigation work. Her first words weren't reassuring. "Mr. Thompson, you've stumbled into the middle of a 20-year investigation that's cost the lives of 6 federal agents and compromised operations across 4 states. She glanced at Sarah with professional assessment. "And you've brought us something we never expected to find, a living witness from the 1920s. "You know about Sarah?" Marcus asked. "We know the Whitmores have been burying people alive since at least 1895. What we didn't know was that anyone had ever survived the process." Foster pulled out a thick manila folder and spread photographs across Morrison's dining table. "These are crime scenes from 12 different states, spanning 8 decades. Everyone involves a suspicious death, followed by rushed burial, no autopsy, and sealed caskets." The photographs were disturbing. Images of opened graves, empty caskets with breathing apparatus, and what looked like underground chambers connected to cemetery plots. Marcus realized the scope of what they'd uncovered was far larger than even Sarah had imagined. Operation Graveyard began in 2004 when we noticed a pattern of missing persons reports that corresponded with unusual cemetery activity, Foster continued. Wealthy families requesting emergency burials, sealed caskets, no viewings, always in small towns where the Whitmores had business interests. Sarah spoke up, her voice weak but determined. How many people? Confirmed dead. At least 237 over the past century, but we suspect the number is much higher. Foster's expression was grim. The Whitmores don't just kill their enemies. They've created an entire industry around it. Other wealthy families pay them to eliminate problems discreetly. Marcus felt sick. It's a murder-for-hire operation disguised as a funeral business. More than that. They've infiltrated cemetery management companies, funeral homes, medical examiner offices, and local government throughout the western United States. When they decide someone needs to disappear, they have the infrastructure to make it happen cleanly. Foster turned to Sarah with obvious fascination. Mrs. Thompson, congratulations on your marriage, by the way. You represent our first opportunity to get testimony from someone who survived their process. But we need to understand exactly what happened to you and how you survived when no one else has. Sarah struggled to sit up straighter. Marcus moved to support her and again felt that strange warmth flow between them. This time, Sarah's color improved slightly, as if his touch somehow strengthened her. The burial in 1923 was supposed to kill me, but something went wrong with their process, Sarah began. Instead of dying, I entered a state between life and death. I was conscious but paralyzed, aware of time passing but unable to interact with the physical world. For 100 years, Foster asked skeptically, time moves differently. It felt more like being in a very long dream where I could observe but not participate. I saw other burials in the cemetery, watched the seasons change, even witnessed some of the Whitmores' later operations when they used nearby plots. Foster leaned forward intently. You witnessed other murders? Dozens of them. I can give you names, dates, locations, but there's something else. Something you need to understand about what the Whitmores are really doing. Sarah's eyes grew, distant. They're not just killing people for money. They're trying to achieve something much more dangerous, which is immortality. The breathing apparatus, the suspended animation techniques, the careful preservation of bodies. It's all research toward finding a way to extend life indefinitely. I think I accidentally became their first successful test subject. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. They're experimenting on living people. The early burials were crude, just murder disguised as natural death. But over the decades, they've refined their techniques. Some of the people I observed being buried were kept alive for weeks or months before being allowed to die. Others were retrieved after short periods and taken somewhere else. Foster was taking rapid notes. Do you know where they were taken? There's a facility about 50 miles east of here, built into an old mining complex in the Beartooth Mountains. They call it the Lazarus Institute. That's where they conduct their real research. Marcus had heard of the Beartooth facility. Locals thought it was some kind of private medical research center. The Whitmores owned the entire mountain valley and kept it heavily secured. We've been trying to get surveillance inside that facility for 15 years, Foster said. It's completely off-limits, even to federal agencies. They claim it's private property used for agricultural research. It's a laboratory where they experiment on kidnapped people, Sarah said flatly. I've seen the transport vehicles coming and going from the cemetery, unmarked vans that arrive after midnight to collect the dead bodies. Foster stood and walked to the window, speaking quietly into a radio. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation, something about satellite, surveillance, and requesting additional resources from the Denver field office. Here's our situation, Foster said, returning to the table. We finally have enough evidence to move against the Whitmores, but we need Sarah's testimony to make it stick in court. The problem is, they know she's alive now and they'll stop at nothing to silence her. There's another problem, Marcus said. Sarah can't survive away from the cemetery for much longer. Whatever keeps her alive is tied to that place. Foster studied Sarah carefully. How long do you have? Hours, maybe less. I can feel myself fading. Sarah looked at Marcus with a mixture of love and desperation. But there might be a way to use that connection against them. What do you mean? The cemetery isn't just where they bury their victims. It's the source of their power. All those bodies, all that death energy, created something unnatural there. If we can disrupt that connection, we might be able to stop them permanently. Foster shook her head. That sounds like supernatural nonsense. So did a woman surviving a burial for a century, Marcus pointed out. At this point, I'm willing to consider any explanation that fits the facts. Sarah struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on Marcus for support. Agent Foster, how many people have you lost trying to infiltrate the Lazarus Institute? 6 agents over the years. They never made it past the perimeter security, because you've been approaching it like a normal facility. But it's not normal. It's protected by the same forces that kept me alive in that grave. You need someone who understands those forces to get inside. Marcus realized what Sarah was suggesting. You want to go back to the cemetery? It's the only way. If I can reconnect with whatever power exists there, I might be strong enough to help you take down their entire operation. But we'd have to do it tonight, before they can move their research to another location. Foster was already shaking her head. Absolutely not. Sending you back to Riverside Cemetery would be suicide. They'll have it surrounded by now. Maybe, Sarah said, but they won't expect us to come back voluntarily. And they definitely won't expect a coordinated federal raid at the same time. Marcus saw the plan forming in Sarah's mind, and despite its obvious dangers, it made a terrible kind of sense. You're talking about using yourself as bait. I'm talking about ending this once and for all. How many more people will die while we play it safe? Foster walked to the radio equipment and began making calls. The conversations were tense and filled with federal acronyms Marcus didn't recognize. But the outcome was clear. They were assembling a major operation for that night. All right, Foster said finally. We'll coordinate simultaneous raids on the cemetery and the Lazarus Institute. But Mrs. Thompson, you need to understand that what you're proposing is essentially a suicide mission. I've been dead for a century, Sarah replied. If I can use whatever time I have left to stop the Whitmores, it's worth the risk. The remainder of the day passed in intensive planning. Foster's team mapped out approaches to both locations, coordinated with other federal agencies, and prepared equipment for what they described as non-conventional threats. Marcus wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but the agents seemed to be taking Sarah's supernatural claims seriously. As evening approached, Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. She could barely stand without Marcus's support, and her skin had taken on an almost ghostly pallor. Yet paradoxically, her mental clarity seemed to increase as her physical strength faded. Marcus, she said as they prepared to leave for Riverside. Cemetery, I need you to know something. What I feel for you is real, regardless of how we met or how long we've known each other. In a century of darkness, you were the light that brought me back to life. Marcus kissed her gently, tasting salt from tears he hadn't realized he was crying. We're going to get through this, both of us. Maybe. But if we don't, promise me you'll make sure the truth comes out. All of it. The murders, the experiments, everything. The convoy of federal vehicles left Bear Lake as the sun set behind the mountains. Marcus rode with Sarah in Foster's SUV, watching the familiar landscape of Montana roll past in the gathering. The darkness. In the distance, storm clouds were building again, another tempest approaching Pine Ridge. Appropriate weather for grave robbing, Foster observed, checking her equipment one final time. "We're not robbing graves," Sarah said quietly. "We're returning the dead to rest and the living to justice." As they approached the outskirts of Pine Ridge, Marcus could see lights blazing at Riverside Cemetery, far more than should have been there at night. The Whitmores had indeed surrounded the place, but Foster's intelligence suggested they were preparing to exhume Sarah's empty grave and eliminate all evidence of their operation. "Last chance to reconsider," Foster said as they parked at the staging area half a mile from the cemetery. Sarah was now so weak that Marcus had to carry her, but her eyes burned with determination. "Agent Foster, in 1923 I was a young woman who stumbled onto a conspiracy and paid for it with a century of living death. Tonight, I'm going to make sure no one else suffers the same fate." The tactical teams moved out through the forest surrounding Riverside Cemetery, their night vision equipment and communication gear giving them advantages the Whitmores couldn't match. But Marcus knew technology would only go so far against an enemy that had been perfecting the art of murder for over a century. As they approached the cemetery's edge, Sarah stirred in Marcus's arms. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The connection is getting stronger, but so is something else, something angry and hungry that's been feeding on all those deaths." Through the trees, Marcus could see the cemetery's lights and the shadowy figures moving between the headstones. The Whitmores had brought their own army to Pine Ridge, but they had no idea that the federal government was about to bring the full weight of justice down on their century-old empire of death. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Marcus prayed that both he and Sarah would live to see another dawn. The moment Sarah's feet touched the ground at Riverside Cemetery, Marcus felt the change. Her body, which had been growing cold and weak in his arms, suddenly surged with otherworldly energy. Her eyes began to glow with a faint silver light, and the air around them crackled with invisible electricity. "Dear God," Foster whispered through the tactical radio. "What's happening to her?" Marcus helped Sarah stand, and she rose with fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone who'd been dying moments before. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there at the cabin, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "The cemetery remembers," Sarah said, her luminous eyes scanning the grounds. "Every soul buried here, every life stolen, every scream silenced. It's all been stored in this place, waiting for someone to give it voice." Through the trees, Marcus could see the Whitmore forces moving between the headstones. They'd brought heavy equipment, excavators, lighting rigs, and what looked like a mobile crematorium. These weren't just covering their tracks. They were preparing to destroy evidence on a massive scale. Foster's voice crackled through the radio. "All teams in position. The Lazarus facility confirms unusual electromagnetic activity. Whatever you're doing down there, it's affecting their equipment too." Sarah walked deeper into the cemetery, her bare feet silent on the wet grass. With each step, the silver glow around her intensified. Ancient headstones seemed to lean toward her, and Marcus could swear he heard whispers rising from the earth. Itself, they're not just burying bodies here, Sarah realized, her enhanced perception revealing secrets hidden for decades. This entire cemetery sits on a confluence of underground rivers. The Whitmores chose this location because water carries memory and death releases energy. They've been harvesting that energy to power their experiments. Marcus followed her toward the heart of the cemetery, where her original grave lay open and empty. The Whitmore team had erected a command tent nearby, and through its illuminated walls he could see silhouettes of people hunched over maps and equipment. "Target acquired," came Foster's voice. "We have visuals of Vincent Whitmore himself. This isn't just a cleanup operation, it's a full family gathering." As they moved closer, Sarah's transformation became more dramatic. Her period dress shifted and flowed as if alive, and her hair moved in winds that touched nothing else. The century of stored experiences was flooding back through her connection to this place, bringing not just memories, but power. "I can see them all now," she said, gesturing toward empty spaces between the headstones. "The victims, they're still here, trapped between worlds by the Whitmore's unnatural methods." Margaret Chen, 1987, buried alive after discovering their tax evasion scheme. David Rodriguez, 1995, paralyzed and buried when he threatened to expose their medical fraud. Jennifer Walsh, 2003, suffocated in a sealed casket after investigating their political connections. With each name Sarah spoke, a faint figure materialized beside the corresponding grave, translucent spirits of the murdered, their eyes burning with accumulated rage. Marcus counted dozens, then hundreds of ghostly forms rising from the earth. The Whitmore security team noticed the supernatural activity simultaneously. Shouts echoed across the cemetery as armed men pointed weapons at phenomena their training had never prepared them for. Several fled outright when the spirits began moving toward the command tent. Vincent Whitmore himself emerged from the tent, a tall, distinguished man in his 70s who carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to absolute power. He showed no fear at the supernatural manifestations surrounding him, only cold calculation. "Sarah Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery. "I should have known you'd eventually become problematic. Your father said you were always too curious for your own good." Sarah stepped into the circle of artificial light surrounding the tent, her spirit army arrayed behind her like a supernatural honor guard. "Vincent Whitmore, still killing innocent people for money, I see." "Innocent?" Vincent laughed. "There's no such thing as innocent people, my dear. There are only those with power and those without. Your father understood that, which is why he cooperated with our arrangement until you forced our hand." Marcus stayed in the shadows, watching this confrontation between predator and prey that had been brewing for over a century. Through his radio earpiece, he could hear Foster coordinating the assault on the Lazarus Institute, where federal agents were discovering horrors that would make headlines for years. "We found them," Foster's voice reported. 37 people in various stages of suspended animation. Some have been here for months. Medical teams are working to revive them now. But Vincent seemed unconcerned about his mountain facility. His attention remained fixed on Sarah with the intensity of a scientist observing a fascinating specimen. "Do you know what you've become?" he asked her. "The process we used on you in 1923 was experimental. We never expected it to work so perfectly. You're not just a survivor. You're the culmination of our research into defeating death itself." Sarah's silver glow intensified, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. "You turned me into a weapon against you, Vincent. Every person you murdered, every life you stole, their energy has been building in this place, waiting for someone to channel it. Which is why you're so valuable to us. Imagine what we could accomplish with an army of beings like you, immortal, powerful, freed from the constraints of ordinary mortality." Vincent's eyes gleamed with fanatic fervor. "Join us willingly and we'll share our vision of a world ruled by those strong enough to transcend death." "I've seen your vision," Sarah replied. "A century of watching you torture and murder anyone who threatens your power. I choose a different path." She raised her hands, and the accumulated spirits of the Whitmore victims began to coalesce into a massive, writhing column of supernatural energy. The very air grew thick with otherworldly power as decades of stored anguish and rage found focus through Sarah's transformed consciousness. Vincent finally showed fear, backing toward his remaining security team. "Kill her!" he shouted. "Kill them both!" Gunfire erupted across the cemetery, but the bullets passed harmlessly through Sarah's glowing form. The spirits surrounding her were less forgiving. They swept toward the gunman like a tidal wave of spectral fury, causing weapons to malfunction and grown men to flee screaming into the night. Marcus felt the incredible energies washing over him, but instead of harm, they brought clarity. He could see the true scope of what the Whitmores had built, a network of death that stretched across the continent, powered by stolen lives and sustained by corrupted institutions. "Marcus!" Sarah called to him, her voice now clearly speaking. "From beyond normal human existence. The binding ritual. We need to complete what we started." Through the chaos of fleeing security forces and manifesting spirits, Marcus understood. Their hasty marriage ceremony had been more than legal protection. It had created a mystical bond that could anchor Sarah's supernatural transformation. But it needed to be completed here, in the place where her journey had begun. Judge Morrison emerged from behind a tall monument, moving with surprising agility for his age. Blood streaked his face from a head wound, but his eyes burned with determination. "I couldn't let you face this alone," the judge said, pulling out his worn Bible. "The Whitmores killed 3 of my agents trying to stop me from getting here, but some things are more important than personal safety." Vincent Whitmore had retreated to his command tent, screaming orders into a radio as his century-old empire crumbled around him. Federal agents were pouring into the cemetery from multiple directions, their tactical lights cutting through the supernatural darkness. "The renewal of vows," Morrison shouted over the increasing chaos. "Speak to them now, while the spiritual energy is at its peak." Marcus grasped Sarah's glowing hands, feeling the incredible power flowing through her transformed being. "Sarah Mitchell Thompson, I bind my life to yours in this world and whatever comes after." "Marcus Thompson," Sarah replied, her voice echoing with otherworldly harmonics. "I bind my death to your life, my past to your future, my justice to your courage." The words seemed to ignite the very air around them. The accumulated spirits of the Whitmore victims swirled faster, their forms becoming more solid and purposeful. Through their growing ranks, Marcus could see federal agents advancing on the command tent where Vincent made his final stand. "It's over, Whitmore!" Foster's amplified voice boomed across the cemetery. "Federal agents, you're surrounded!" But Vincent wasn't finished. He produced a device that looked like a modified medical defibrillator, its metal plates crackling with electrical energy. "If I can't have immortality," he snarled, "then no one can." He triggered the device, sending a massive electrical discharge into the ground. The energy was designed to disrupt the supernatural forces powering Sarah's transformation, but instead of weakening her, it had the opposite effect. The electrical surge connected with the underground water system, carrying the accumulated death energy throughout the entire cemetery's foundation. Every grave, every burial, every life that had ended in this place suddenly contributed to the growing supernatural storm centered on Sarah. "He's made it stronger," Marcus realized, as Sarah's form blazed with silver fire that turned night into day. The spirits around them were no longer just the Whitmore victims. They were every soul ever laid to rest in Riverside Cemetery, centuries of the dead called back to witness justice being served. Their combined presence created a vortex of otherworldly energy that lifted Sarah several feet off the ground. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of everyone who had ever been silenced by the powerful Vincent Whitmore. "For your crimes against the living and the dead, you are judged." The spectral army descended on the command tent like a hurricane of supernatural vengeance. Vincent's screams echoed across the cemetery as justice long delayed finally arrived. When the spirits dispersed moments later, only an empty tent remained. Vincent Whitmore had simply vanished, erased from existence by forces he had spent a lifetime trying to control. Federal agents secured the area as the supernatural activity gradually subsided. Foster approached Marcus and Sarah cautiously, clearly unsure how to interact with someone who had just commanded an army of the dead. "It's over," Sarah said, her glow beginning to fade as the spiritual energy returned to its dormant state. "The network is broken, the facility is captured, and the victims have found peace." Marcus caught her as she collapsed, her supernatural transformation finally ending. But unlike before, she didn't seem to be fading. Instead, she appeared more solidly human than ever, as if channeling the collective energy of the dead had somehow anchored her permanently to the world of the living. "The marriage binding worked," she whispered, smiling up at him. "I'm truly alive now, not just existing between worlds." Foster holstered her weapon and approached them. "We'll need extensive debriefing, and there will be trials, investigations, congressional hearings. This case is going to rewrite federal law enforcement protocols." "And Judge Morrison?" Marcus asked, looking around for the brave man who had risked everything to help them. "Already on his way to the hospital," Foster replied. "He'll recover. The man's tougher than he looks." As dawn broke over Riverside Cemetery for the second time in their relationship, Marcus and Sarah stood among the peaceful headstones where their extraordinary journey had begun. The federal agents were cataloguing evidence. The supernatural manifestations had returned to dormancy, and the Whitmore Empire lay in ruins. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, still hardly believing they had survived. Sarah looked around the cemetery with eyes that held both ancient wisdom and newfound hope. "Now we live, really live, and we make sure this kind of evil never takes root again." Marcus kissed his wife as the sun rose over Montana, illuminating a world where justice had finally triumphed over a century of hidden darkness. Their story had begun with a grave being dug in a storm, but it ended with two souls finding each other across the impossible divide between life and death. The dead could finally rest in peace, and the living could move forward into a brighter dawn. 3 months after the events at Riverside Cemetery, Marcus Thompson stood in the witness box of the Federal District Court in Denver, facing the largest criminal trial in Montana's history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, federal prosecutors, and family members of the Whitmore victims, some of whom had been presumed dead for decades. "Mr. Thompson," said Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Hernandez, "please tell the court what you discovered when you opened the casket in Plot 247. Marcus had told this story dozens of times to FBI agents, congressional investigators, and psychiatric evaluators, but it never got easier. "I found Sarah Mitchell alive but in some kind of suspended state. She'd been buried there since 1923. The defense attorney for the surviving Whitmore family members immediately objected. "Your Honor, this testimony relies on supernatural claims that have no basis in scientific fact." Judge Elizabeth Warren, who had been specially assigned to handle the unusual evidence in this case, overruled the objection. "The court has reviewed extensive medical documentation of Mrs. Thompson's condition. Whatever the explanation for her survival, her testimony regarding the Whitmore conspiracy has been corroborated by physical evidence and federal investigation. Continue, Mr. Thompson." The trial had been proceeding for 6 weeks, with prosecutors methodically building their case against 12 members of the extended Whitmore family and 37 associates involved in their murder-for-hire network. Vincent Whitmore himself remained missing, officially classified as disappeared under suspicious circumstances, though Marcus knew the truth about his supernatural erasure. Sarah sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, looking remarkably healthy for someone who had technically been dead for a century. The mysterious energies that had transformed her during the cemetery confrontation had stabilized into something resembling normal human physiology, though she retained certain enhanced abilities that federal scientists were still trying to understand. "After your wife's rescue," Attorney Hernandez continued, "what did you learn about the scope of the Whitmore operation?" "That it wasn't just murder for money," Marcus replied. They were running medical experiments on kidnapped people, trying to develop ways to extend life indefinitely. The Lazarus Institute had been operating for decades, using victims who were supposed to be dead. Dr. Amanda Rivers, the federal forensic pathologist who had examined the institute, had testified earlier about the horrors they'd discovered there. 37 people in various stages of induced coma, their bodies subjected to experimental procedures designed to halt or reverse the aging process. Most had been revived successfully, though the psychological trauma would require years of treatment. "And how many total victims have been identified?" Hernandez asked. Marcus looked at the chart displayed on the courtroom screen, a comprehensive map showing burial sites across 12 states. Over 400 confirmed murders spanning from 1895 to 2024, but Agent Foster believes the actual number could be much higher. The numbers were staggering even to Marcus, who had lived through the investigation. Financial records seized from Whitmore Properties showed payments from wealthy clients across the country, all seeking to eliminate personal or business problems through permanent means. Politicians, journalists, business rivals, whistleblowers, inconvenient family members, anyone could become a target if the price was right. Rebecca Foster took the stand next, detailing the federal investigation that had been building evidence against the Whitmores for 20 years. Her testimony revealed the true scope of their corruption. Bought judges, compromised medical examiners, owned funeral directors, and entire cemetery management companies that existed solely to facilitate their operations. The Whitmore Network had infiltrated death-related industries throughout the western United States, Foster explained. They could orchestrate a murder, fake the autopsy results, arrange the burial, and eliminate all evidence within 48 hours. It was a nearly perfect system. What broke that system? Hernandez asked. Foster glanced at Marcus and Sarah. A gravedigger who refused to accept that dead people stay buried, and a woman who survived the impossible to seek justice. During the lunch recess, Marcus and Sarah walked through downtown Denver, marveling at how normal their life had become. They'd moved from Pine Ridge to a small ranch outside the city, where Sarah was slowly adapting to 21st century life, while Marcus worked as a consultant for the federal task force investigating cemetery-related crimes. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked as they sat in a quiet cafe, watching ordinary people go about their daily routines. Marcus considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, his biggest concerns had been maintaining cemetery equipment and managing his modest savings. Now, he was married to a woman who had been born in 1898, owned a ranch purchased with reward money from the federal government, and possessed first-hand knowledge of one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history. "Only that it took us over a century to find each other," he replied, earning a smile that lit up Sarah's entire face. Their afternoon was interrupted by a call from Foster, who had disturbing news from the ongoing investigation. "We found another facility," she told them over the phone. "This one's in Nevada and it's still operational. The Whitmores had contingency plans we didn't know about." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "How many people?" "Unclear, but satellite imagery shows recent construction and vehicle activity. We're assembling a task force, but—" Foster hesitated. "Marcus, Sarah, we could use your help. Sarah's abilities to sense supernatural activity might be crucial if they're using the same techniques as the Montana operation." Sarah had been listening on speakerphone. "Of course we'll help. How many more people have to suffer while we pretend this is over?" 2 days later, they were aboard a federal helicopter flying over the Nevada desert toward a facility that officially didn't exist. The Lazarus Institute in Montana had been a research center, but this new location appeared to be a full-scale production facility, a place where the Whitmores' death-related services could be provided on an industrial scale. "Thermal imaging shows at least 60 people inside the main building," the pilot reported. "Some appear to be staff, but others are in what look like medical beds or containment units." Sarah closed her eyes and extended her supernatural senses toward the facility below. The abilities she'd gained during her transformation had stabilized into something she could control and direct, though they still occasionally surprised her with their intensity. "There's death energy here," she reported, "but also something else. Fear, desperation. These people are alive but trapped in some kind of suspended state." Her eyes snapped open with alarm. "Marcus, they're not just experimenting anymore. They're mass-producing whatever they did to me." The assault on the Nevada facility was coordinated with military precision. Federal agents surrounded the complex. While Marcus and Sarah approached from the desert, using her enhanced senses to identify hidden entrances and security measures that conventional surveillance had missed. Inside the facility, they discovered something far worse than the Montana Institute. Row upon row of medical beds held people in various stages of induced coma, their bodies connected to machines that regulated everything from heartbeat to brain activity. Unlike the research subjects in Montana, these victims appeared to be part of an assembly line process. "They're creating an army," Sarah realized, studying the facility's layout. "Look at the organization, intake areas, processing stations, storage units. This isn't research anymore, it's manufacturing." Dr. Helen Cross, the facility director they captured during the raid, eventually revealed the terrifying scope of the operation under federal interrogation. The Whitmores hadn't just been selling individual murders. They'd been developing the capacity to fake mass casualties and harvest entire populations for their experiments. "We were preparing for the next phase," Cross admitted during her confession. "Climate change, economic collapse, social unrest. The wealthy needed a way to survive while maintaining control over reduced populations. The suspended animation technology would allow them to outlive any crisis." Marcus felt sick as the implications became clear. They were planning to fake their own deaths and wait out the collapse of civilization, while keeping essential personnel in suspended animation to rebuild according to their specifications, Foster added. "A shadow government that could emerge after any catastrophe with advanced knowledge and supernatural longevity." The Nevada raid yielded 87 victims in various stages of the process, along with evidence of similar facilities in California, Texas, and Florida. What had started as a murder-for-hire operation had evolved into a conspiracy to reshape human civilization itself. Back in Denver for the trial's continuation, Sarah took the witness stand to testify about her century of forced observation and the supernatural forces the Whitmores had been manipulating. Her testimony was unlike anything ever heard in a federal courtroom. Detailed accounts of murders spanning decades, descriptions of experimental procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics, and revelations about the true scope of their conspiracy. Mrs. Thompson, the defense attorney, asked during cross-examination, "You claim to have been conscious but paralyzed for over 100 years. How is that possible?" "I don't know the scientific explanation," Sarah replied calmly. "I only know what I experienced. The Whitmore's process created a state between life and death that preserved consciousness while suspending normal bodily functions. Whether that's supernatural or represents unknown science doesn't change what they did to me and hundreds of others." "But you admit you have what you call supernatural abilities now. Isn't it possible that your testimony is influenced by delusions or psychological trauma?" Sarah's eyes flashed with controlled anger. "Every detail of my testimony has been corroborated by physical evidence, financial records, and the confessions of captured Whitmore operatives. If I'm delusional, then so are the federal agents, the forensic accountants, and the victims we rescued from their facilities," the defense attorney pressed further. "You've gained financially from these allegations, haven't you? The federal government has paid you substantial reward money. "I've gained the chance to live a normal life after a century of imprisonment," Sarah replied. "Money can't compensate for what they took from me, but it can help ensure that other families don't suffer the same losses." Judge Warren intervened before the questioning could become more hostile. The court notes that Mrs. Thompson's testimony has been extensively corroborated by independent evidence. Her personal circumstances, however unusual, don't negate the substantial case built by federal investigators. The trial's final week featured closing arguments that would be studied in law schools for decades. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Financial records showing payments for hundreds of murders, medical evidence of illegal experimentation, testimony from dozens of survivors, and the physical evidence of multiple facilities designed for mass-scale human trafficking and medical assault. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Attorney Hernandez said in her closing statement, "the Whitmore family created an empire built on the systematic murder of innocent people. They corrupted institutions, bought officials, and turned death itself into a business opportunity. The evidence shows a conspiracy so vast and so evil that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about human decency." The defense, led by expensive attorneys hired by what remained of the Whitmore fortune, argued that their clients were victims of a government conspiracy to seize private property, and that much of the evidence was based on supernatural claims. That had no place in a court of law, but the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges for all defendants. The Whitmore family members received sentences ranging from life without parole to multiple consecutive terms that ensured none would ever see freedom again. As Marcus and Sarah left the courthouse after the sentencing, they were approached by dozens of family members whose loved ones had finally received justice. Some had been waiting decades for answers about mysterious disappearances. Others had discovered that relatives they'd mourned were actually still alive in federal protective custody. "Thank you," said Margaret Chen's daughter, embracing Sarah with tears in her eyes. "My mother disappeared in 1987 when I was 12. I never knew what happened to her until now." Similar scenes played out across the courthouse steps as families found closure that many had never expected to receive. The Whitmore trials had exposed not just a criminal conspiracy, but a wound in the American justice system that stretched back over a century. That evening, Marcus and Sarah sat on the porch of their ranch, watching the sunset over the Colorado mountains. The federal investigation would continue for years, with new facilities and victims being discovered regularly. Sarah's supernatural abilities had proven invaluable in locating hidden sites and identifying victims, leading to her recruitment as a special consultant for the FBI's new Supernatural Crimes Division. "Do you think we got them all?" Marcus asked, referring to the remaining Whitmore operatives still being hunted by federal authorities. "The organization is broken," Sarah replied, "but people that evil don't disappear completely. There will always be others who try to profit from death and suffering." Marcus took her hand, still marveling at the warmth of her touch after everything they'd been through. "Then I guess we'll have to stay vigilant." Sarah smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "Together." As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that stormy night at Riverside Cemetery. He'd gained a wife, a purpose, and a front-row seat to one of the most important criminal prosecutions in American history. Most importantly, he'd learned that even the darkest evil could be overcome when people chose to stand up for justice, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The dead could finally rest in peace. The living had found justice, and Marcus and Sarah Thompson faced their future together, ready for whatever supernatural mysteries might come their way. 1 year after the Whitmore trials, Marcus Thompson received a phone call that would prove their victory had been incomplete. He was working in his garden behind the Colorado ranch when Sarah came running from the house, her face pale with concern. "It's Agent Foster," she said, holding out the satellite phone. "There's been another incident." Marcus wiped dirt from his hands and took the call. Foster's voice carried the same urgency he remembered from their first desperate night at Bear Lake. "Marcus, we need you and Sarah in Washington immediately. Something's happened at Arlington National Cemetery that doesn't make sense through conventional investigation." "What kind of something?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer would involve the supernatural elements that had become his unwelcome specialty. 3 military graves were found empty last night. Not robbed, empty. The caskets were intact, still sealed, but the bodies inside had vanished completely. Security cameras show nothing but... Foster paused. "There were energy readings similar to what we recorded at Riverside Cemetery during the Whitmore confrontation." Sarah was already moving toward the house to pack. Her enhanced senses had been growing stronger over the past year, and she'd learned to trust the intuitive warnings that came with them. Now those warnings were screaming that something was very wrong. The flight to Washington took 4 hours, during which Foster briefed them on developments they hadn't been told about during their quiet year of recovery. The Whitmore investigation had uncovered connections to military contractors, Defense Department officials, and what appeared to be a shadow network within the government itself. "We thought we'd dismantled their operation," Foster explained as their plane descended toward Andrews Air Force Base, but evidence suggests the Whitmores were just one branch of something much larger. Vincent Whitmore didn't create this conspiracy, he inherited it. Marcus felt a familiar chill. How much? Larger? We're talking about organized crime families that have been manipulating American institutions since the Civil War. The Whitmores specialized in civilian targets, but there are other families focused on military personnel, government officials, even foreign diplomats. Sarah leaned forward in her seat. "The empty graves at Arlington, those weren't random targets. They were chosen specifically." "How do you know?" Foster asked. "Because I can feel the residual energy from here. Whatever happened to those bodies, it wasn't natural death or normal decomposition. Someone used supernatural methods to extract them, and they did it for a specific purpose." Arlington National Cemetery at night was unlike any place Marcus had ever experienced. The endless rows of white headstones stretched across rolling hills like a vast city of the dead, each marker representing a life given in service to country. The presence of so much sacrifice and honor created an almost tangible atmosphere of solemnity. Dr. James Mitchell, the cemetery's chief administrator, met them at the main gate. He was a retired Army colonel who had overseen Arlington for 15 years, and his usual military composure was clearly shaken. "I've never seen anything like this," Mitchell said as he led them toward the affected graves. The caskets were opened from the inside, not broken into, opened, as if the occupants had pushed their way out. The 3 graves belonged to soldiers who had died in different conflicts spanning 60 years. Sergeant William Hayes, killed in Vietnam in 1968. Captain Maria Santos died in Iraq in 2003. Lieutenant Colonel David Kim lost in Afghanistan in 2018. They had no apparent connection beyond their military service and burial at Arlington. Sarah knelt beside the empty grave of Sergeant Hayes, placing her palm against the earth. Her eyes closed in concentration as she extended her supernatural senses into the ground. "They're not dead," she said quietly. Or rather, they weren't dead when they were removed from these graves. Someone used technology similar to what the Whitmores developed to preserve them in suspended animation. Marcus examined the opened caskets with growing unease. The metal showed no signs of external force, but the interior had scratch marks that suggested desperate attempts to escape from within. "Agent Foster," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the otherworldly quality that indicated she was accessing deeper layers of supernatural perception. This wasn't just grave robbing, it was recruitment. Foster knelt beside her. Recruitment. For what? Someone is building an army of soldiers who are supposed to be dead. People who can operate without official existence, without families asking questions, without any ties to the living world. Sarah's eyes snapped open with alarm. And they're not working alone. The sound of helicopters approaching interrupted their investigation. But these weren't federal aircraft. The unmarked black helicopters descending toward Arlington carried no identification and moved with military precision that suggested official sanction. "We need to leave," Marcus said, recognizing the signs of a coordinated operation designed to eliminate witnesses. "Now." But Sarah remained motionless beside the grave, her enhanced senses detecting something the others couldn't perceive. "It's too late. They're already here." Dark figures emerged from behind nearby headstones, not the living, but something else entirely. Marcus could see through their translucent forms to the cemetery beyond, yet they moved with purposeful intelligence that suggested consciousness and intent. "The reanimated soldiers," Sarah breathed. "They've been turned into something between life and death, just like I was. But unlike me, they're under someone else's control." The ghostly figures of Hayes, Santos, and Kim approached their group. With military precision, their dead eyes fixed on Sarah with unmistakable hunger. Behind them came more spectral soldiers, dozens, then hundreds of military personnel who should have been resting in peace. "They want what I have," Sarah realized. "The life force that keeps me anchored to the world of the living. If they can steal it, they can become fully corporeal again." The helicopters had landed, disgorging teams of people in military gear who moved to surround the cemetery. But Marcus noticed something odd about their equipment. It included devices he recognized from the Whitmore facilities, machines designed to manipulate supernatural energies. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a voice over amplified speakers, "you're trespassing on a classified military operation. Surrender immediately, and you will not be harmed." Foster drew her weapon, though Marcus doubted conventional bullets would be effective against spectral soldiers. "This is FBI agent Rebecca Foster. You're interfering with a federal investigation." "Not anymore," the voice replied. "As of tonight, supernatural incidents fall under military jurisdiction. Executive Order 14823, signed this morning by the President." Marcus felt the world shifting around them. Someone with access to the highest levels of government had been planning this moment, waiting for the right opportunity to claim control over supernatural phenomena and the people who could manipulate them. Sarah stood slowly, her own supernatural aura beginning to manifest as the spectral soldiers drew closer. "They've been watching us for months, waiting to see how my abilities developed. This was never about investigating empty graves. It was about capturing me." The ghostly soldiers suddenly rushed forward with inhuman speed. Sarah's silver glow erupted in response, creating a barrier of pure energy that sent the attackers reeling backward. But Marcus could see the effort was draining her. There were too many of them, and they were being reinforced by new spectral arrivals every minute. "The underground tunnels," Dr. Mitchell whispered urgently. "Arlington has service tunnels that connect to the Pentagon. We can reach them through the maintenance building." They ran through the cemetery as chaos erupted around them. Sarah's supernatural abilities flared wildly as she fought off spectral attacks while simultaneously trying to shield the others from supernatural assault. The military teams were advancing from multiple directions, their strange equipment crackling, with energies that interfered with Sarah's powers. "They have technology I've never seen before," Sarah gasped as they reached the maintenance building. "Devices that can disrupt supernatural energy, maybe even capture it." The building's basement entrance led to a tunnel system that had been constructed during the Cold War as emergency evacuation routes for high-ranking officials. Dr. Mitchell led them through narrow concrete passages lit by emergency lighting, moving toward what he hoped would be safety at the Pentagon. But safety was an illusion. The tunnels were already occupied by more military personnel, and these showed no signs of being controlled by outside forces. They were living soldiers following orders from legitimate commanders. Dr. Sarah Thompson called their leader, a general whose uniform carried more stars than Marcus could count. "I'm General Patricia Hayes. My father was Sergeant William Hayes, whose grave you've been investigating." Sarah stopped running, her supernatural senses confirming what the general had just revealed. "Your father is one of the spectral soldiers." "My father has been given a second chance to serve his country," General Hayes replied, "as have hundreds of other fallen heroes. The technology we've developed allows us to recall the dead for continued military service." Marcus felt sick as the implications became clear. "You're using supernatural technology to enslave dead soldiers." "We're utilizing available resources to protect national security," the general corrected. "The Whitmore investigation revealed capabilities that could revolutionize military operations. Soldiers who can't be killed because they're already dead, who require no food or rest, who feel no fear or hesitation." Foster stepped forward, her federal authority meaning nothing in this underground confrontation. "General, you're describing the creation of an undead army that violates every principle of human dignity and military honor." "Human dignity is a luxury we can't afford when facing existential threats," General Hayes replied. "Climate change, resource depletion, potential alien contact. America needs every advantage to maintain global leadership." Sarah's supernatural senses were detecting something the others couldn't perceive: the presence of other entities in the tunnels, beings that weren't human and weren't recently dead. "General Hayes," Sarah said carefully, "who taught you how to reanimate the dead? This technology didn't come from the Whitmore research." The general's expression flickered with uncertainty. "That information is classified above your clearance, a level." "Because you don't know either," Sarah realized. "Someone approached your department with this technology. Someone who understood supernatural forces far better than any human organization. You're not controlling this operation. You're being used by it." The tunnel lights began flickering as Sarah's enhanced perceptions detected the true scope of what they faced. The military operation was legitimate, but it was being directed by entities that had their own agenda for humanity's future. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, "we're not just fighting human corruption anymore. There's something else here, something that's been manipulating human institutions for far longer than the Whitmores." Before Marcus could respond, the tunnel filled with an otherworldly presence that made his skin crawl. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and shadows began moving independently of their sources. "The architects," Sarah breathed, her face going white with recognition. "I've seen them before during my century underground. They're the real power behind all of this." The military personnel around them suddenly stood at rigid attention, their eyes taking on an unnatural glow. General Hayes spoke, but her voice carried harmonics that suggested someone else was using her vocal cords. "Sarah Mitchell Thompson," the entity said through the general's mouth, "you have interfered with our work long enough. Your transformation was an accident we have spent decades trying to replicate. Now you will help us perfect the process." Marcus realized they were facing something far worse than government conspiracy or military overreach. The Whitmores, the supernatural technology, even the reanimated soldiers were all tools being used by entities that operated on a scale beyond human comprehension. "What do you want?" Marcus demanded, though he wasn't sure the things controlling the soldiers would even acknowledge his existence. "Evolution," came the reply through multiple voices now, as more military personnel became conduits for the otherworldly entities. Humanity has reached the limits of biological development. We offer transformation into something greater, beings that transcend the constraints of life and death. Sarah's supernatural aura flared brighter as she prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just their survival, but possibly the future of human free will itself. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying absolute determination, "remember what I told you about being willing to fight for what matters. This is what matters. The right of people to live and die on their own terms, not as tools for entities that see us as evolutionary stepping stones." The tunnel filled with supernatural energy as two incompatible visions of humanity's future prepared to clash in the darkness beneath Arlington National Cemetery. Marcus gripped Sarah's hand, knowing that whatever happened next would either save the world or condemn it to a fate worse than death. The real war was just beginning. The confrontation in the Arlington tunnels never came. As Sarah's supernatural energy reached its peak, preparing to battle the entities calling themselves the Architects, something unexpected happened. The possessed military personnel suddenly collapsed, their otherworldly glow extinguished as if someone had cut a power cord. Temporal displacement activated, came a new voice from deeper in the tunnel system. "The Architects have been pushed back approximately 18 hours. We have limited time to explain." From the shadows emerged a figure that made Marcus question his sanity all over again. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with silver hair and eyes that held the same otherworldly quality as Sarah's, but magnified tenfold. She wore clothes that seemed to shift between modern and ancient styles with each step. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," she introduced herself, helping General Hayes to her feet as the military officer regained normal consciousness. "Temporal Sciences Division, though that department doesn't officially exist yet." Sarah stared at the newcomer, with recognition dawning in her enhanced perception. "You're like me, transformed by the same forces, but you've learned to control them. I'm what you'll become in about 30 years, if we can prevent the Architects from completing their plan," Elena replied. "I'm from 2054, Sarah. In my timeline, humanity lost this war." Marcus felt his grip on reality slipping again. Time travel, supernatural entities, government conspiracies, and now alternate timelines. Each revelation made their situation more incomprehensible. "Agent Foster," Elena continued, "in my timeline, you founded the Supernatural Defense Initiative in 2027. It became humanity's last hope against the Architect invasion, though ultimately it failed." Foster, who had been remarkably adaptable throughout their supernatural adventures, finally looked overwhelmed. "You're telling me I'm going to start some kind of paranormal military unit?" "You already have, in a sense. The investigation into the Whitmores was the first step." Elena gestured for them to follow her deeper into the tunnel system. "But we need to accelerate the timeline significantly. The Architects aren't just manipulating human institutions, they're preparing for direct invasion." As they walked through passages that seemed to extend far beyond the official Pentagon tunnel system, Elena explained the true scope of humanity's situation. The Architects were extra-dimensional beings who had been subtly influencing human development for centuries, guiding civilization toward a point where humanity could be transformed into a species more suitable for their purposes. "The Whitmores weren't criminals," Elena revealed. "They were an early prototype of what the Architects wanted. Humans who had transcended normal death, who could serve as permanent agents in the physical world." Vincent Whitmore's disappearance wasn't supernatural justice. It was extraction. Back to the Architect dimension for evaluation. Sarah's face went pale. "Then my transformation wasn't accidental either." "You were meant to be a prototype, yes, but something went wrong with the process. Instead of becoming their servant, you..." retained your free will and human compassion. You became something they hadn't expected, a hybrid being who could oppose them with their own power. Dr. Mitchell, who had been quietly following their group, finally spoke up. This is insane. You're talking about interdimensional warfare using cemetery plots and zombie soldiers. I'm talking about a species fighting for its survival, Elena corrected. In my timeline, by 2040, 60% of the human population had been transformed into architect servants. The remaining humans lived in hidden enclaves, constantly hunted by armies of the reanimated dead. They emerged from the tunnels into what appeared to be a vast underground facility that definitely wasn't part of any official government installation. The space was filled with technology that seemed decades ahead of anything Marcus had seen, alongside artifacts that looked ancient, beyond measure. "Welcome to Sanctuary Alpha," Elena said. "One of 12 facilities we're building to serve as command centers for the resistance that hasn't started yet." The facility bustled with activity from people who looked human but moved with the same otherworldly precision Marcus had observed in Sarah. Some appeared to be from different time periods, clothing and mannerisms that spanned from the Victorian era to what he assumed was the far future. "Temporal refugees," Elena explained, noticing his confusion. "People pulled from different timelines where the architect invasion succeeded. Each brings knowledge and abilities that might help us prevent the same outcome in this reality." A man approached them wearing what looked like a Union Army uniform from the Civil War, but his eyes held the same supernatural awareness as Sarah and Elena. "Colonel Jonathan Pierce," he introduced himself with a slight southern accent. 1863. "Originally, though I've been fighting the architects across multiple timelines for what subjectively feels like centuries. The invasion has been happening repeatedly," Elena continued. "Different timelines, different outcomes, but always the same basic pattern. The architects identify key human individuals who could threaten their plans, then either convert them or eliminate them before they can organize effective resistance." Sarah was examining the facility's mix of technologies with growing understanding. They've been doing trial runs, testing different approaches across multiple realities to find the most effective invasion strategy. Precisely. And in most timelines, they've succeeded. This reality represents one of our last opportunities to break the cycle. Elena led them to a central chamber where screens displayed information from dozens of different Earth timelines. "But we have advantages here that we've never had before." Marcus studied the timeline displays, seeing variations of their own world where the Whitmore conspiracy had succeeded, where Sarah had died in her grave, where supernatural forces had openly conquered human governments. In some timelines, he saw himself living a quiet life in Pine Ridge, never knowing that his world had been secretly conquered by otherworldly entities. "What makes this timeline different?" Foster asked. "You," Eleanor replied, pointing to each of them in turn. "Marcus, your refusal to accept that Sarah was dead disrupted their carefully planned conversion process. Sarah, your retention of free will despite supernatural transformation created a template for human resistance. Agent Foster, your federal investigation exposed the scope of their infiltration decades earlier than in other timelines. Colonel Pierce moved to a tactical display showing the current state of architect infiltration across the globe. Red zones covered most of Europe and Asia, with expanding areas of influence throughout North and South America. The possession events at Arlington were a desperation move, Pierce explained. "We disrupted their planned timeline by exposing the Whitmore network, so they're accelerating their invasion schedule. Military reanimation was supposed to be introduced gradually over the next decade." "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "In my timeline, open warfare began on Christmas Day 2025, Eleanor said grimly. Simultaneous attacks on major population centers using armies of reanimated dead. Governments fell within weeks, and organized human resistance collapsed within 5 years. Sarah was studying her own reflection in one of the facility's polished surfaces, watching the way supernatural energy moved beneath her skin. Elena, in your timeline, how did I die? You didn't. The architects captured you and used your hybrid nature to perfect their conversion process. By 2030, they could transform, living humans into willing servants in a matter of hours. Elena's expression was haunted. I watched you lead armies of the converted against the last human strongholds, completely convinced you were saving humanity from its own limitations. Marcus felt cold terror at the thought of Sarah being turned into a weapon against the people she'd fought to protect. How do we prevent that? By changing the fundamental nature of the conflict, Elena replied. In every previous timeline, humans tried to fight the architects using conventional methods, military force, political resistance, technological development. All failed because the architects operate on levels of reality that normal humans can't access. She gestured towards Sarah with obvious reverence. But you're not normal humans anymore. Sarah's transformation created a bridge between human consciousness and architect power. If we can replicate that process safely, we can create a human resistance that operates on the same supernatural level as our enemies. Foster looked skeptical. You're talking about intentionally transforming people into supernatural beings. I'm talking about evolution, Elena corrected. The architects are right about one thing. Humanity has reached the limits of purely biological development. The choice isn't between staying human or becoming something else. The choice is between evolving into willing servants or evolving into something that can fight for human values and free will. Dr. Mitchell, who had been quietly observing the facility's impossible technology, raised a practical concern. Even if this works, how do you convince people to undergo supernatural transformation voluntarily? Most humans barely accept that any of this exists. Colonel Pierce smiled grimly. That's where the timeline advantage comes in. In this reality, we have video evidence of the Whitmore trials, federal documentation of supernatural phenomena, and eyewitness testimony from respected sources. The foundation for public acceptance already exists. Elena led them to another section of the facility, where human volunteers were undergoing various stages of supernatural enhancement. Unlike the horrific experiments of the Whitmore Institute, these procedures appeared to be carefully designed to preserve human consciousness while adding supernatural capabilities. The process isn't perfect yet, Elena admitted as they watched. Volunteers who glowed with various colored auras, learning to manipulate otherworldly energies. About 30% of subjects experience psychological trauma, and 5% don't survive the transformation. But those who succeed gain abilities that can counter architect influence. Sarah approached one of the volunteers, a young woman whose silver aura reminded Marcus of Sarah's own supernatural glow. How do you feel? Sarah asked gently. Like I can see colors that don't have names, the volunteer replied with wonder. And I can sense emotions and intentions from across the room. It's overwhelming but also liberating, like I was partially blind before and can finally see the whole spectrum of reality. Marcus realized he was witnessing the next stage of human evolution. Not the corrupted servitude the architects desired, but genuine enhancement that preserved human dignity and choice. Yet the risks were enormous, and the timeline was impossibly compressed. Elena, he said, in your experience, what's our best chance of success? Rapid deployment of enhanced humans to key positions in government, military, and civilian leadership. Elena replied without hesitation. We need people who can detect and resist architect influence, in charge of critical infrastructure before the open invasion begins. And Sarah's role in all this. Elena's expression became deeply serious. Sarah is the template from which all our enhancement procedures are derived. But more than that, she's the only being in this timeline who can directly confront the architects. On their own level, when the invasion begins, she'll be our primary weapon against their leadership. Sarah absorbed this information with the quiet dignity Marcus had come to love about her. I accept that responsibility, but I won't become what I fought against. If I'm going to be enhanced further, it has to be with full understanding and consent. At every step. Of course, Elena agreed. Free will is the foundation of everything we're fighting for. The moment we start forcing people to change, we become indistinguishable from our enemies. Foster was studying intelligence reports from around the world, tracking patterns of unusual activity that suggested accelerating architect preparation. How much time do we have to set up this enhanced resistance network? Best case scenario, 6 months, Elena replied. More likely we have until the winter solstice, December 21st, 2025. That date has significance in multiple timeline invasions. Marcus looked around the facility at the temporal refugees, enhanced volunteers, and impossible technology that represented humanity's last hope for maintaining its freedom. 6 months to transform from normal people into supernatural warriors, to build a resistance network across the globe, and to prepare for a war that would determine whether human consciousness survived in any recognizable form. Then we'd better get started, he said, taking Sarah's glowing hand in his own. We've stopped one conspiracy already. Time to stop the biggest one of all. Elena smiled for the first time since meeting them. Welcome to the real fight, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. Let's save the world. As alarms began sounding throughout the facility, indicating new architect activity detected worldwide, Marcus realized their quiet life on the Colorado ranch was permanently over. The war for humanity's future had officially begun, and they were standing at the center of humanity's desperate gamble for survival. December 21st, 2025. Winter solstice. Marcus Thompson stood on the observation deck of Sanctuary Alpha, watching. Streams of data flow across holographic displays that tracked supernatural activity worldwide. In the 6 months since Elena Vasquez had revealed the true scope of humanity's peril, the world had changed beyond recognition. Governments now openly acknowledged supernatural threats. Enhanced humans served in key positions across the globe. And Sarah had become the most powerful being on Earth, but none of it felt like enough. Phase 1 activation detected in 17 major population centers, reported Dr. Kim Nakamura, one of the enhanced coordinators who had volunteered for supernatural transformation 3 months earlier. Her silver aura pulsed with urgent data, streams as she interfaced directly with global monitoring systems. The architects are beginning their invasion. Sarah emerged from the enhancement chamber where she had undergone her final transformation. The woman Marcus had married bore little physical resemblance to the frail figure he'd pulled from that grave 15 months ago. She now stood nearly 7 feet tall, her body suffused with energy that made the air itself shimmer around her. Yet her eyes remained unmistakably human, filled with love for him and determination to protect everything they'd built together. "How do I look?" she asked with a smile that could have powered the entire facility. "Like someone who's about to save the world," Marcus replied, though his heart ached at how far she'd had to evolve beyond normal humanity to protect it. Elena appeared beside them, her own enhanced form crackling with temporal energy. "All sanctuary sites report ready status. We have 12,000 enhanced humans deployed globally, with another 8,000 in accelerated training. It's not the army we wanted, but it's the army we have." Through the facility's enhanced communication systems, they could observe the opening moves of the architect invasion. In London, Paris, Tokyo, and New York, spatial rifts were opening in major cemeteries, allowing beings of pure energy to pour into the physical world. The reanimated dead rose from graves across 6 continents, but these weren't the crude zombies of popular fiction. They were sophisticated soldiers with supernatural abilities and strategic intelligence. Military response is proving ineffective, reported Colonel Pierce, whose own century of supernatural warfare experience made him invaluable for tactical coordination. Conventional weapons can't harm entities that exist partially outside normal reality. Enhanced resistance cells are engaging, but they're severely outnumbered. Marcus watched footage from around the world as humanity's enhanced defenders battled against overwhelming odds. In Central Park, a team of enhanced New York police officers fought a desperate holding action against spectral soldiers pouring from an architect rift. In the Australian outback, enhanced Aboriginal rangers used ancient knowledge combined with supernatural abilities to defend sacred sites that the architects were trying to corrupt. "Sarah," Eleanor said urgently, "it's time. The architect command." Hierarchy is manifesting in the primary dimensional nexus. If you're going to confront them directly, it has to be now. Sarah nodded and moved toward the facility's central chamber, where a massive technological array had been constructed around the original gravesite they'd transported from Riverside Cemetery. The connection between Sarah and that place remained strong, and it would serve as her anchor point for what everyone understood might be a one-way journey into the architect dimension. "Marcus," Sarah said, taking his hands as he followed her to the chamber, "I need you to understand something. Where I'm going, normal human consciousness can't survive. If I succeed in stopping the invasion, I might not be able to return to this reality in any form you'd recognize." Marcus had known this moment would come, but the reality still hit him like a physical blow. There has to be another way. There isn't. The architects exist on levels of reality that require transcendence, beyond anything we've achieved so far. To defeat them in their own realm, I'll have to become something closer to them than to humanity. Sarah's enhanced senses detected his emotional anguish with painful clarity. "But our love will survive whatever I become. That connection is stronger than dimensional barriers." Elena was monitoring energy readings from the Nexus chamber as reality itself began to warp around Sarah's enhanced form. "Dimensional barriers are weakening. The window for interdimensional transit will only be open for approximately 4 minutes. Sarah kissed Marcus one final time, and he felt the incredible power flowing through her, the accumulated energy of every supernatural encounter they'd shared, every moment of connection, every choice they'd made together that had led to this ultimate confrontation. "Remember me as I am now," Sarah whispered, "not as whatever I become to save our world." She stepped into the Nexus chamber as space itself began to fold around her. The technology was based on architect principles captured from various timelines, but operated by human will and powered by love rather than the cold calculation that drove their enemies. Marcus watched through enhanced senses as Sarah's form began to shift between dimensions, her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of normal existence. On screens throughout the facility, they could observe the effects of her dimensional transition, architect forces worldwide suddenly hesitating as their command structure detected an unprecedented threat. "She's in their realm now," Elena reported, her temporal senses tracking Sarah's progress through realities that human language had no words to describe. "The architects are surprised. They didn't expect a hybrid consciousness to achieve such complete dimensional transcendence." Through the Nexus sensors, Marcus caught glimpses of the battle unfolding in spaces between spaces. Sarah faced beings of pure, malevolent intellect that had manipulated countless species across multiple galaxies, entities that saw biological life as nothing more than raw material for their experiments in consciousness manipulation. But Sarah brought something to the conflict that the architects had never encountered: love that transcended dimensional boundaries, human determination enhanced by their own stolen power, and the accumulated will of every person who had ever chosen to fight for freedom rather than accept servitude. "The invasion forces are faltering," reported Dr. Nakamura, as global monitoring systems registered massive disruptions in architect operations. Dimensional rifts are destabilizing worldwide. Whatever Sarah's doing, it's working. Marcus watched readouts that showed his wife battling entities whose very existence warped the fabric of reality. She had become something beyond human comprehension, yet he could still sense the core of who she was, the woman who had awakened in a grave and chosen to fight rather than surrender to circumstances that should have been impossible to overcome. "Energy spike detected in the Nexus chamber," Elena announced with growing excitement. "She's found their central command node. Sarah's engaging the primary architect consciousness directly." The facility shook as interdimensional energies cascaded through reality itself. On screens around the world, they watched architect forces simply dissolving as their connection to their home dimension was severed. The reanimated dead collapsed back into peaceful rest. Spatial rifts collapsed harmlessly. The invasion that had succeeded in dozens of other timelines was being systematically dismantled by one woman who refused to let evil triumph. But the cost was becoming evident as Sarah's physical form in their reality grew increasingly translucent. To maintain her assault on the architect dimension, she was transferring more and more of her essential self into that alien realm. "Marcus," Elena said gently, "you need to prepare yourself. Sarah's consciousness is spreading across multiple dimensional levels. Even if she wins, she might not be able to consolidate back into a form that can exist in our reality." Marcus understood, but he wasn't ready to accept it. "Sarah," he called out to the Nexus chamber, "remember our promise, together, no matter what." For a moment, Sarah's form solidified in the chamber, and her voice echoed with power that shook the facility's foundations. "I remember my love, but together doesn't always mean in the same dimension." The final confrontation lasted subjective hours, but occurred in seconds of real time. Marcus watched readouts that showed Sarah's consciousness expanding to encompass entire regions of the architect dimension, using their own techniques against them to trap their leadership in a prison of pure will and human determination. When it ended, silence fell across every monitoring system in the facility. Global readings showed complete cessation of architect activity. The invasion had been stopped, the interdimensional threat neutralized, and humanity preserved its right to evolve on its own terms. But the Nexus chamber stood empty. "She did it," Elena whispered with awe. "Sarah didn't just stop the invasion, she severed the architect's ability to access our reality permanently. They're trapped in their own dimension, contained by barriers built from human love and determination." Marcus stared at the empty chamber where his wife had made the ultimate sacrifice. Around the world, enhanced humans were reporting the same phenomenon, a sense of peace and protection that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. "She's not gone," Dr. Nakamura said suddenly, her enhanced senses detecting something the others had missed. "Sarah's consciousness is distributed throughout the dimensional barriers she created. She's become the guardian that protects our reality from future supernatural threats." Over the following days, as humanity began to process what had occurred, Marcus discovered the truth of Nakamura's words. In quiet moments, he could sense Sarah's presence, not as a physical being, but as a protective force that watched over everything they had built together. Enhanced humans reported feeling her guidance during difficult decisions. Children playing in cemeteries spoke of a kind lady made of light, who made sure they felt safe. Elena found Marcus sitting in their old ranch in Colorado a week after the solstice, watching the sunset over mountains that looked exactly the same, despite the fact that the entire world had fundamentally changed. The enhanced humans are forming a permanent organization, Eleanor told him. The Supernatural Defense Initiative that I mentioned from my timeline, but founded 10 years early and with a much happier mandate. We're calling it the Sarah Thompson Foundation. Marcus smiled at the appropriateness of that name. She'd like knowing that her sacrifice led to protection rather than more warfare. Marcus, there's something else. The dimensional barriers Sarah created are responsive. They seem to react to human need and emotion. Several enhanced individuals have reported direct communication with what appears to be Sarah's distributed consciousness. Marcus felt a familiar warmth, the same sensation he'd experienced when first touching Sarah's hand in that grave so many months ago. Around him, the air shimmered with almost imperceptible silver light. "She's here," he said with certainty. "Different than before, but still here." Elena nodded, her temporal senses confirming what Marcus felt. The love that bound you together transcended dimensional barriers. Sarah found a way to be with you while also protecting all of humanity. As the years passed, Marcus became the primary liaison between normal humanity and the enhanced individuals who protected the world from supernatural threats. The Sarah Thompson Foundation grew into a global organization dedicated to using supernatural abilities for healing, protection, and the preservation of human free will. Marcus never remarried, but he was never alone. In moments of doubt or sorrow, he could feel Sarah's presence offering comfort and guidance. When he helped enhanced individuals learn to control their abilities, her wisdom flowed through him. When he spoke to world leaders about maintaining the balance between human enhancement and human dignity, her voice whispered the right words. On quiet evenings at the ranch, Marcus would sit on the porch and speak aloud to the silver light that danced around him, telling Sarah about his day, about the good work being done in her name, about how much he missed her physical presence while treasuring the deeper connection that death itself couldn't sever. 25 years after the Architect invasion, as Marcus lay dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 77, the last thing he saw was Sarah's luminous form reaching out to take his hand. She looked exactly as she had on their wedding night, young, beautiful, and radiating love that transcended every boundary reality could impose. "Ready to be together again?" she asked with the smile that had captured his heart in the darkness of a grave. "I've been ready since the moment you saved the world," Marcus replied. They walked hand in hand into a light that was neither supernatural nor natural, but simply the continuation of a love story that had begun with a man who refused to accept that the dead must stay buried, and a woman who refused to let evil triumph over hope. Behind them, the Sarah Thompson Foundation continued its work, protected by the dimensional barriers their love had created, and guided by the wisdom of two souls who had chosen each other across impossible circumstances and held onto that choice. Through transformations that redefined the very nature of existence. Their story became legend, then mythology, then simply the foundation upon which a better world was built. A world where love could overcome any darkness, where ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges, and where the boundary between life and death was just another obstacle that true devotion could transcend. In cemeteries around the world, people reported seeing silver light dancing among the headstones, bringing comfort to the grieving and ensuring that the dead could rest in peace while the living were free to choose their own destiny. The grave that had started it all remained empty in Riverside Cemetery, but it was never truly vacant. It had become a shrine to the power of love over death, hope over despair, and the infinite possibility that existed when two souls chose to face the impossible together. Marcus and Sarah Thompson's story was finally complete, but their love remained eternal, a guardian force that would protect humanity's freedom for as long as stars burned in the sky and hearts beat with the courage to choose light over darkness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.